Welcome to another edition of Crisis Communications in Sports, where we break down the communication breakdowns in the sports world. Now, from PRCG Sports, here's marketing veteran Jim Rocco and Crisis Communication strategist Isaac Benjamin.
This is Crisis Communications in Sports. Welcome to our last episode of 2020. I'm Jim Rocco, my co-host is Isaac Benjamin, and our producer is Alex Baldonado. As always, we've got an absolutely terrific guest coming up shortly. If the name Jay Horwitz sounds familiar to you, it's because almost any New York area baseball fan over a certain age has seen and heard Jay in action as the PR director for the New York Mets for nearly 40 years. But before we get to that conversation, Isaac, I know you've been following this Mike Krzyzewski story the past week or so, as I have, and I found it pretty fascinating. So just to recap for anyone who's not familiar with it, Duke got off to a bad start this year. They are now 2-2, I believe, and their two losses were against teams they shouldn't have lost to. Obviously, this is all amid the pandemic. So the esteemed coach of Duke, Mike Krzyzewski, who most people, even non-basketball fans, know, has said that he wants to rethink this whole thing about having a season, and has actually even gone so far as to Duke has canceled their non-conference games. A lot of people, especially the considerable amount of Duke haters that are out there, have called him out on this, saying, you wouldn't be saying this if Duke hadn't gotten off to such a bad start. So it really seemed disingenuous, and he's taken a lot of heat for it. I have my thoughts on it. I wanted to gauge where you are and take your temperature on this.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what I think. I have a buddy who's an assistant coach for a D3 program. And he's been texting me for some time that there seems to be a lot of upsets, and it's because D3 was practicing sooner than D1. They are more cohesive as a team. We're able to head back earlier. And that's sort of producing some of these incredible upsets that really jazz up D2, D3 players to say, I'm just as skilled. So I think some of what Coach K is remarking on is that his teams, partially because they're losing, are not where they would be in a normal year. And I think that everybody loves to jump on Duke for any reason that they can. I myself, my father went to Chapel Hill, so I'm never mincing words when it comes to Duke. But I think we have to remove ourselves for a little bit and assume that Coach K, somebody who's invested in the success of college basketball and invested in the success of March Madness, recognizes that this is a very weird situation. And I don't think this is as much as, oh, hey, my career record is going down because we've lost 2 games because my guys are not as prepared, and more that this is a guy who's been around for 30 years. And we can all be aware of this elephant in the room and say it's really weird, and maybe we should revisit it. I also know that you disagree with that, Jim.
Well, it's not so much I disagree about it, and for the interest of everyone listening, I'm indifferent about Duke. Don't love him, don't hate him. So my feeling was this: he did do a bit of a flip flop here, because back in July he was like, the NCAA tournament has to happen. Now, we were in the middle of a pandemic then too. Everyone knew there was going to be a spike in the fall. So, the timing is such that after his team gets off to a bad start is when he starts chirping that, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. So the timing was poor. Now, I will say this, in his 70s and having accomplished what he's already accomplished, I don't think Coach K is concerned or worried about what the general public thinks, especially the Duke haters of the world. It would be a lot different, however, if we were talking about a 38-year-old first-year coach. So I think he's sort of resigned himself to the fact, just shrug his shoulders and say, let's move on. I think we were talking about a younger guy with less experience. It would be absolutely necessary to come out and clarify your statements a little bit more. Because, look, it could be fairly genuine. I know that he's saying, listen, our players need a rest mentally and physically. And that's a legit point. It's just that the timing was horrible. And I think he's able to get away with it, so to speak, if I could kind of do air quotes around that, because he's Coach K.
Right. This all happened because the Alabama coach, Nate Oates, sort of raised this and said, this is a double standard here. He's saying this because they lost, and he is a much younger guy who's less established. I think that what's really interesting, you're seeing this, we've been seeing this in college sports. You see all these head coaches who are natural born leaders, right? I don't think there's a head coach in the NCAA who doesn't buy in to this leader of men attitude. And they all feel the need to have not just have an opinion, but really be able to say, I'm going to lead by example by either supporting this or advocating against it. And you raised a good point. I mean, Coach K said the exact opposite earlier in the year. I think we're seeing people feel the need to opine and feel the need to make declarative statements when the reality is nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows if in 4 months we're going to regret not waiting, or if there's no vaccine, we're going to say, well, why did we wait or why didn't we wait if there's nothing changing? But I think you're faced with a lot of people, a lot of head coaches who feel the need to say, I'm leading by example, and this is what I think. And that's where you end up flip-flopping. And that's precisely how you get to a point where people think you're inauthentic by expressing concern. Or frankly, conversely, they think you're being inauthentic if you're saying, let's just play, let's focus.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that, well, let's put it this way. I think a lot of people feel, and I could certainly understand this, that he might not be saying this if they were 4-0, because a lot of the teams that have gotten off to good starts also have a conscience, but they're not saying this. They think, listen, mentally, it's important for us to play for our kids, for our fan base. So I think that's a difference where, it's not hard to think, even if you are very fond of Coach K, to imagine that if they had gotten off to a great start, he might be singing a different tune. For the past 2 years, Jay Horwitz has served as the Vice President of Alumni Relations and Club Historian for the New York Mets. Prior to that, he spent nearly 4 decades as the venerable head of the team's media relations department. Jay has written a new book, aptly titled Mr. Met, and we were fortunate enough to catch up with him recently in the hopes that some of his considerable wisdom would rub off on us. Jay Horwitz, welcome to Crisis Communications in Sports.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So Jay, you are widely known, especially to people of my generation who grew up in the New York area, as a PR extraordinaire. Just someone who was omnipresent for 4 decades on the New York scene, and you have a great new book out called Mr. Met, and I'm excited to be reading that and find it. Even as a Yankee fan, I'm still excited to learn about it because I just associate you with an era, especially in the 80s when the Mets were really surging. What was it like back then when the Mets were coming in, from the early to the mid 80s, when they really started to turn things around and become the team that we all knew in 86? What was the feel back then?
Well, it really all started in 1983 in October. We hired Davey Johnson as a manager. Davey was the kind of a guy, he didn't really care what he said. He was very outspoken. Davey was a multi-millionaire. He was a real estate guy, flew his own plane. He just spoke his mind. He was a perfect manager for the team. It was like my first 3 years here, we weren't relevant. And when we added, Davey and Darryl Strawberry, Keith, Gary Carter, Doc, Ron Darling, it became not knowing what to expect. We got to the ballpark. A lot of these guys had really big personalities. They appeared not only the sports pages, the front page of the paper. It's well known some of the guys did get into trouble with drugs and alcohol. So it was like a thing. When you came to the party, you never knew what to expect. They kept me on my toes all the time, and it was from like 84 to 90, we took over New York, and we were the talk of the town, and it just just kept you on your toes. As soon as you got to the ballpark, and a lot of times driving home from the ballpark, you get a call about one of our guys.
Yeah, I gotcha. One of the things that you sort of inherited a little bit, I guess, was you mentioned some problems with drugs with Keith Hernandez and the cocaine issue, which happened back when he was on the Cardinals, but he
Right.
did actually get summoned to testify at some point when that story was breaking. And there's a great piece in the book about how you chose select reporters to speak to and without follow-up questions, and how that was the right solution for that particular issue, and that Keith went on to, play well, and the writers were satisfied. Could you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
Yeah, the one thing why I was able to exist in a locker room for 40 plus years or whatever the hell I was there, you have to walk the line. You have to let the players know that you care about them. I never regarded myself as a suit. So when Keith came back from Pittsburgh, really the night before we were in San Diego. I think he got 4 hits the night before, like before they got on the plane. So we just thought the best way to do it when he came back, Arthur Richmond, who was a traveling secretary at the time, got us a suite in a hotel. The guys came up. They asked him questions. Keith said what he had to say, and from then on, for the rest of the year, Keith and I talked. He would say, "Hey guys, I addressed the issue. I don't have to keep going over and over again." So the thing is that, all those guys, from Darryl and Keith and Doc, the reason they're still so popular is they never ran from anything. They addressed their problems. So we just thought the best way with Keith not to run away with it, which he didn't want to, but we addressed it once. And then when we would get questions and reporters would ask questions, I would a lot of times step, "Hey guys, he answered that question already," to kind of let the Keith or the guys know I was in their corner and I had their back. And that was an important thing for me how to get along with these group of guys.
Can you take us back to ramping up to that initial press conference and meeting with the media in the hotel? I mean, how did you go about picking who was going to be there, what the forum was going to be?
We was basically the beat guys. I don't remember who was there. It was the beat guys who traveled with us. At that time it would have been Joe Durso from the New York Times, Dan Castellano from the Star Ledger, Marty Noble from Newsday, more maybe Mike McAlery, just the people who traveled with us. So, and we told them this is the format, and we made Keith available. We took it away from the ballpark so it wouldn't be a distraction to the game. Then when he got back there, he addressed it once, he said his thing, and that was that. It was just the whole thing was to not hide anything. The one thing I learned early working in New York, if you hide or don't tell the truth, you get caught. I mean, I'll give you one quick story. We had a player, we went on to have hopefully a Hall of Fame career. Jeff Kent, we were in St. Louis. Jeff used to travel with a gun he used to practice on a hunting range when we went to different cities. We went through that. We did at that time. There's no charters, so we went through a public, security thing. They got his gun. We explained what it was. He was there just to, we had practice at a gun range, and we told the press about what happened instead of waiting to leak out or Jeff Kent arrested at St. Louis Airport. So we told the truth. And early on, I found out that you can't. There's just too many media people there, and me as a public relations guy, once they catch you in a lie and your credibility is done, you're done. I mean, maybe you get away with it in smaller markets like Kansas City or Detroit or whatever, but once you get caught with a lie in it, like New York, Chicago, LA, you're done. So I always try to just tell the truth and have the players' interest at heart, but get the story out there.
Absolutely, yeah.
What happens when you have to juggle the interests between the player, the team, and your credibility? And sometimes those are 3 different angles that might not necessarily meet up.
Well, I mean, you have to have an open dialogue with the ownership. Once the time in my years with the Wilpons, they trusted me. They had a good sense about me. So we would talk about it. We had, in some parts of the time, we had a crisis committee. We would talk about certain things. But the thing is, maybe you don't tell all the truth sometimes. You get most of it out there. And I think the players knew. I think ownership knew they had the best interest of the organization at heart. I mean, I couldn't have existed there for 40 years if there was a feeling that they didn't trust me with stuff. But I just try to, again, walk the line between being what's good for the player and being what's good for the organization. I mean, go back to the Keith thing. If, it might have been even better for the organization if he didn't speak or why prolong the story, but they agree with my suggestion. Just do it in a controlled setting, get it out there, do it once, and control it the rest of the year after that.
You actually just mentioned something, Jay, that's kind of music to our ears. You said that the Mets had a crisis committee,
Right.
which is brilliant and which we're always preaching to people. What prompted that? I mean, aside from maybe a need, but like, how did you guys decide? Like, we need to designate certain people to decide what's going to happen if a crisis occurs.
Well, we had somebody from the legal department, somebody representing ownership, somebody representing, marketing and communication. I was in there, but a lot of times, it's all well and good, but you have to, since I was on the road most of the time, if stuff came up, I would maybe call the lead person on the committee, tell him what I was going to do, and he read it by the other people. But when you have long range stuff, you can talk about problems that come up, But it was just a way to talk it out. Like somebody in legal might have a different view than me, and just to hear it out, just to really talk around about long range problems, just to have sounding boards to get other people's opinion. So your opinion wasn't the only opinion.
What would sort of fall into your lap that you could handle by yourself, and what did you feel was the red line they'd have to bring it up to that crisis committee?
I'll give you. Say we're on the road in Chicago, and Darryl Strawberry was taken out of the lineup, for an injury. I would just let the people know in New York. We're telling the people what happened, so that and they're not surprised when the ownership or the general manager listens to TV that night and Darryl Strawberry is out of the lineup. I'm just trying to give you. I mean that's really about it. I mean we had some curfew problems on the road where I would let people know so they weren't surprised and what would happen. Just try to keep the people who had to be in the know. The worst thing in the world for me, like if somebody above me heard about a problem with the team before they heard it from me. And that's what I try to prevent, to keep the people who had to be in the loop so they knew what was going on with the team.
How did that change over time? Obviously, now they say that most trades in Major League Baseball happen without GMs even getting on the phone. It's all texting. And in this crisis committee, did it evolve over time? So it's more of a constant text thread, emails, or was it still giving a phone call and then we're going to meet?
It was mostly by focus. Now the thing is now, nothing with Twitter and Instagram and all the other things, nothing's a secret anymore. It's all got to be by text or by phone or by word of mouth. I mean, you just if something happens, you have to pick up a phone and call somebody. And if you sign a big free agent now, it's never gonna be quiet. You have to. It's gonna be out there before. I stopped writing press releases about 10 years ago. I mean, when the age of when did Twitter come in? Whenever Twitter came in, either the agents or the guys like John Heyman or Buster Olney, they break. Ken Rosenthal, they'll break stories all the time. So there's no such thing as a secret anymore. I mean, it's kind of been a little bit passe. It's got to be by word of mouth, and just the thing is, the ownership people have to trust the PR person who's on the road that he'll have the best interest of the team at heart.
It's interesting. Your career has spanned since, the days of just, the typical tabloid newspapers into social media age. What was that like for you? How was that? Was that a big adjustment, or did you embrace it at first, or were you skeptical?
I embrace it, but the thing is, we started to do player seminars in the spring. When in the advent of social media, that just you have to be aware who you go to a restaurant with, who you go on, ride up an elevator with.
Right.
Who's the what happened with the swimmer Mark Phelps? Some of his friends posted a picture of him, doing drugs.
Hmm.
You might go up in the elevator, you put your arm around somebody who's not your wife, your girlfriend. That'll be on social media. So the last couple of years, we just preach it to Met. You got to be aware of your surroundings. Don't take anything for granted. Try to stay away if you tweet. Try to stay away from controversial stuff. You can make 50% of people happy, 50% of people unhappy. So you just try and be conservative what you tweet and just be aware of your surroundings. But really now, nothing's a secret anymore. I mean,
Yeah.
if you always, a lot of times the club will listen to Heyman and Ken Rosenthal, Buster Olney to find out what's going on in the baseball world, because they call the agents, they call the GMs in the other clubs. So yeah, that's a tool to find out what's going on.
Yeah. So we're talking to Jay Horwitz. Mr. Met is the name of his book. He's been the PR director for the Mets for 4 decades. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in the book, Jay, was there's sort of a fine line sometimes between taking what could be a little bit of a negative and playing off it for a little bit of energy and otherwise just having it be a total crisis. So one thing I thought was interesting in 86, which was obviously the big World Series year for the Mets, there were during the season a few different scuffles that had gone on. And I think was it Ray Knight and who was it?
Yeah, Ray and Eric
And Eric
Davis.
Davis when he slid hard into third and
Right,
punches were
right.
thrown. I thought it was really interesting. You said you liked the notion of the fighting Mets sort of thing, and that you kind of turned that negative into a little bit of positive because it was sort of an edgy feel that fed into the Davy Johnson Mets.
Yeah, the rest of the National League hated us. I mean, we were boastful. We had the players to back it up. In that particular game, Eric Eric Davis slid in hard to third base, and when he got up, Ray and I clocked him, and that was, a couple of times during the year we got the beanball fights, and George Foster got hit early in the year. That's why Mike Tyson, before he became Mike Tyson, chose us to come out. He took BP pictures with Darryl and
Yeah,
Doc and
I remember
Ray and
that.
Kevin Mitchell.
Yeah.
It was just that particular fight was an example of why we were so good. We didn't back off from anybody, and in the league we were boastful. We had the talent to back up the boast, but that particular game, it ended with Jesse Orosco and Roger McDowell in the outfield, Gary Carter at third base. So I mean, we just keep fighting to the end, and we alienated a lot of people along the way, and we had the people to back up the boast.
And to your credit, you found a way to embrace it and make it a positive. That was the swagger of that team, and it worked.
It was the swagger. That particular game was, yes, sir.
So a couple of the other scuffles that happened, I think this was the same year, was the Keith Hernandez, Darryl Strawberry thing. So now you have an in-team situation when they're taking the
Yeah,
team
that
picture.
was it. I didn't program that. This was the spring. It was. I think it was spring of was 87 or 80. I think whatever it was.
Right.
Make a long story short, that Darryl was under the impression that Keith had said some things about him in the winter, which might have hurt him getting an MVP. And I don't know what was right or wrong.
Mhm.
So in the middle of our team picture, in the middle of the field at Port St. Lucie, they exchanged blows and they started a fight, which they broke it up. And I said I was happy because that team picture got publicity all over the country. I got congratulatory notes from all the fellow PR guys saying, "Way to get PR, national PR for a team picture was usually the boring event." So I told guys, well, I asked the guys to fight to help me get the good PR out of it.
Might as well take the credit. Yeah.
Right.
I'm kind of interested in learning how you would balance your responsibility, especially when the Mets were good. But it's also New York. How do you balance your responsibility to the beat reporters versus national reporters? When you were talking about which reporters they're relying on now, the Heymans and everybody, they're all national. So, and we know that when there's a story, good or bad, that's when national swoops in. How do you balance that?
Well, I mean, the whole thing is really going back to not lying and telling the truth and knowing where the market that we're in, that you can't lie. I think why I was Weber, how I existed was I was credible. The players knew that I had their backs. When I used to go to Keith or Darryl after a problem, they knew I had their best interest. Like in the '86 World Series, Dwight didn't have his best 2 games. He lost both games, gave him a lot of runs, and won the game. And I said, Doc, after one of the games in Boston, he says, we have to go to the bullpen where they had their press room and talk. And I didn't want he knew I had his interest at heart. I didn't want him to walk out of there without talking to the writers. So they knew when I would ask him to do something that was unpleasant, that I still, even though it was unpleasant, I still had their best interest. And whether it's the local guys, the national guys, for a PR guy to be successful, you have to establish that trust with the players. And again, keep in mind, I work for the organization. So, I mean, I didn't mind. It would be a bad thing for the organization if one of our star players walked out of the room after not in that kind of an atmosphere. We're not talking to the writers. So just a question of having to trust in the players, not lying, and just just try to walk the fine line between telling the truth and not losing your credibility with the beat guys. Like 10 years ago, we used to travel 10, 12, 14 beat guys on a regular game, and you get to the playoffs, it's like 100. So once they find out you lied, you're a dead person.
Jay, one of the things that I'm always explaining to people outside of New York is the dynamic between the Yankees and the Mets. Cities like Boston and some other ones that have passionate fan bases, Philadelphia, but like they don't really get that. You grow up either a Yankee fan or a Met fan in New York, and you're fighting the other team before you even fight anyone outside your city. What was it like for you, being the Met PR guy in an era when, they had some success and then the Yankees had success and it was always back and forth. Uh, I always got the impression you sort of relished in, being the Met guy, as opposed to, like you were always sort of like, maybe the younger brother fighting up in weight. Did you sort of feel that way as well?
I love the competition. I consider it a bit. I'm in the business of getting back pages in the papers, getting guys on the radio. I used to go on me in one particular sequence. I think when we signed Carlos Beltran, they signed Randy Johnson the next day. I think I could have my facts screwed up,
Hmm.
but I took it as a competition. I try to, find interesting stuff about the players, promote human interest stuff, but it galled me when the Yankees would get back page after back page, and I always took an offense to it in my position that I can't give up. I mean, Met fans were always, I think they're the working people of the city. The Yankees have won X amount of championships. We won, two World Series. They've won 27 to 28. So people will say, well, we don't play against the Yankees, but we do. We compete against the Yankees for time in the papers, on the radio, on the talk shows. So I took it as a personal battle to try and win the battle as much as I could.
Yeah, and you always seem to have a knack for finding the interesting things. You mentioned about like, digging up stuff about the players' human interest stories. Even going back early in your career, you were credited a lot of times with being, creative and generating buzz. Was that something of like a natural gift, or is that something you just consciously worked on?
Well, you know what it was. I don't know how many guys have read the book, but part of it comes from my background. I mean, I was born blind in my right eye. My mother, when she carried me, she got German measles, had glaucoma in my right eye. I had put an artificial eye put in when I was 13. So I was always on the lookout for human interest stuff. I not the normal stats, home runs. When I was hired by the Mets in 1980s, really off of my background at Fairleigh Dickinson, which is New Jersey.
Right.
In my time at Fairleigh Dickinson, we had Steve Dembowski, second baseman, got hit by a pitch 128 times. We had a one-arm fencer. We had a priest who played hockey. A football player who was 44 years old. We had a wrestler who had 6 kids. You get the drift what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
I felt because of my background, I always look for the behind the scenes, what made a person tick. My early years with the Mets, we had good success. Doug Flynn was our second baseman at the time, signed country and western with the Oak Ridge Boys. Lee Mazzilli, before he came to the Mets, was a national speed skater. Craig Swan was a trainer in the winter. I used to look for different things, what would go behind the scene. That's why the Mets hired me, because they saw what I was able to, because of the athletes I worked with, get national publicity with Fairleigh Dickinson. We had a high jumper at the time, Franklin Jacobs, who was 5'6". He set a Guinness World Record. He jumped 2 feet over his head,
Wow.
and he won the Milrose games at the Garden. So I was able to look. Not you can hit. We were up against, when I was at Fairleigh Dickinson, we were up against Rutgers, Seton Hall, all the top colleges. But I was able to generate a lot of national publicity because of the human interest people that I found, and that's when I continued with the Mets.
Hmm. And one of those fascinating stories that you didn't initiate, but you certainly played along with to a T, was the Sid Finch April Fool's story,
Yeah,
which I found fascinating, and I loved
yeah. You
hearing
couldn't do it today. A couple of
couldn't
years
no,
ago, and it
absolutely couldn't.
happened. Frank Cashin was friendly with George Plimpton and Mark Mulvoy, who was the editor of Sports Illustrated at the time. So they called me in probably the winter of spring trade of '85. That George Plimpton, who I love because I'm a diehard Kennedy guy growing up. I was Camelot and the whole thing, and George Plimpton was affiliated with the Kennedy family. So he had this idea, the April first edition that year, they were going to do a story and how the Mets signs the 6'8" pitcher from the Yukon, wherever he was from, who had a 190-mile-an-hour curveball or fastball.
Yeah.
So, and they said, Frank said to me, "You think you could sell?" I said, "But Frank, it's my cup of tea." So what we did the day the story came out, and the late Mel Stoudemire and I, we concocted a pitching tent in the back of the field in Huggett Stango Field in St. Lucie, and we had this. Sid was a school teacher from Chicago. He was this gangly guy, didn't never looked anything like a pitcher. So when after he supposedly threw a bullpen session, Ron Reynolds, who was one of our catchers at the time, came out and we burnt a hole in his glove. And we see this was Sid's 120-mile-an-hour curveball. And we kept that story going for 2 days. I got a call from one of the editors, one of the New York papers, said, "How could you give that story to Sports Illustrated? We cover you all the time." I said, "How would you like it if I gave a story you had?" But nobody really picked up that the first paragraph is this is an April Fool's joke in the
Yeah, the initial cap,
in the
right, of
thing.
each thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you just couldn't do it today with Twitter and the whole bit, but it was fun.
Right.
Following year we had a Sid Finch retirement day, so that was a great story. I loved working on that kind of
And never
stuff.
and never had any trepidation about doing it. You just went along with it right at the get-go.
No. After the stuff I did in college, this was great. And the thing is, it never hurt anybody. It
Yeah.
never hurt anybody. That
Right.
was the thing.
Yeah, obviously, we have to ask you about the Subway Series. That's a whole story in and of itself. Just the two New York teams meeting like that. I mean, obviously, between the Dodgers, Giants, and Yankees, they met loads of times in the '50s. But what was that sort of like a pinnacle of your career in some ways? Like, what was that like for you when those two
Well, I
teams came
found I had a
together?
lot of friends I never knew. I got a call from someone I went to school number one in Clifton. I don't want to give his name. He said, Hey, Jay, this is Bob Smith. I always knew you go into sports. Um, uh, I'm looking to get 4 tickets for game one of the Subway Series. I'll even pay for them.
Right.
So this is a guy I was in second grade with. He knew I was going to be working in sports back then. It was an exciting time. It was wall to wall coverage. I mean, my phone never stopped,
Right.
and and it was just, I just felt looking back, if I felt that team, the 2000 team, we won 94 games, swept through the playoffs. We lost to the Yankees, a great Yankee team, in 5 games by a total, like, I think, 5 runs.
Right.
We led going into the 9th inning, the first game, lost in the 12th. I still think Mike Piazza's home run is going to be a home run in Game 5, but I just never felt that team never got the credit, except for Mike. Really didn't have a lot of superstars. It was, the Jay Paytons, the Timo Perez's, the Todd Zeals,
Right.
and it was. I just felt the team never really got the credit deserved, but it really was an exciting time, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
Jay, what crises that you lived through didn't make it into the book? What don't we know?
Well, again, the whole stuff. Why I was able to be around a long time. I never really would. John Franco told me a long time ago. What goes on in the locker room stays in the locker room, and I never. When I wrote this book, it was never going to be a tell-all book about what did this guy do, or on the famous plane ride from Houston to New York after the '86 playoff, who did what on the plane, what particular guy do in the training room. It wasn't going to be that, guys, and that's why it wasn't that kind of a book. I wrote the book for 2 really specific reasons. Number one, I was hoping to encourage some people who were born with not perfect, whether it's one leg, one arm, a speech impediment, that you didn't have to be perfect to to get along in the world. I was born with one eye, had a pretty decent career for myself. Another thing I had a chapter in the back of the book to Shannon Ford, who was my associate for 22 years. She died of breast cancer at the age of 44 with 2 young kids. And I didn't want people to forget about her. Shannon is probably one of the most courageous people I've ever met. She, as cancer spread across her body, she still came to work every day. And I just felt it was important to, to let people know what she was. And when she died in the spring of 2016, 9 teams in professional sports held a moment of silence for her, and there's a field in her honor built in her hometown in Little Ferry. So, the other stuff I really, they were looking for who said this about what. It wasn't going to be me, So I took Johnny's advice.
Yeah. Well, good. I mean, it's nice to shed a light on things like that, and it's inspiring. As have you been, sir. Thank you so much for being on the show. Again, the book is called Mr. Met, Jay Horwitz. Thank you so much, and we wish you continued success in your alumni relations role with the Mets now.
Okay.
And we look forward to anything else that you've got coming up.
Okay. Good luck to you. Be happy. Be safe, everybody.
Yes, you too.
Thank you, Jay.
Okay. Take care. Right. Bye.
So, Isaac, I have to say, for as long as we've been doing this now, that was easily one of my favorite interviews. It's just so much fun to listen to a guy like Jay Horwitz, who's been there, done that in the New York sports PR scene. And one, it was just fun to hear all the old stories, but 2, I just felt like I learned and absorbed so much, but just by speaking to him.
Yeah, in preparing for the interview, I spoke with a bunch of people who have worked with him over the years. And he's as friendly and down to earth as they all described. I'm most surprised that if I had to handle all the fires he's put out over the years, I'd be a lot more gruff. And he definitely is a glass half full kind of guy, and I love it. That's it for another episode of Crisis Communications in Sports. Please make sure to rate and review wherever you find podcasts and let us know who you'd like us to bring on in future episodes. Signing off for the last time in 2020 from the House of the Haggerty Built. Stay out of trouble.